Morning. My name is Andrew Lewin. I am the chair of the UK Trade and Business Commission. Thank you to everybody who is joining us online this morning. Our latest evidence session today is going to be focused on the approach to the President of the United States to trade policy and, of course, the US-UK economic prosperity deal, which was signed a few weeks ago. As usual, I am joined by a fantastic team of commissioners that bring a wealth of experience, and we have three guest panelists today to share their insights. They are Emily Lydgate, who is the co-director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, Dr. Deborah Elms, who is the head of policy at the Heinrich Foundation, and Jun Du, the professor of economics at Aston Business School. Now, before we talk to our panelists, our guest panelists this morning, I'm particularly pleased that we're joined by Sir Kim Darroch, who has a unique insight into what it's like in working with the current incumbent of the White House. And we thought an appropriate place to start this morning was to ask Sir Kim for his reflections on what really is Donald Trump's approach to trade policy.
Andrew, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for this opportunity. It's a really timely discussion in the week when a deadline has passed for trade deals on Trump's reciprocal tariffs of 2nd of April, and deadlines have been extended, so the story goes on. But tariffs and trade are again top of the agenda. I mean, one way or another, of course, Donald Trump dominates every news cycle, but trade is the stuff of this week. I wanted to cover these opening remarks, two things really. First of all, just some general background on how Donald Trump sees trade and tariffs. And second, just some comments on the UK-US deal, which was secured a few months ago, where I think there are a few things that are worth flagging up at this stage. But let me start with basically why Donald Trump likes tariffs. And the important thing to realize here is he has supported and advocated tariffs for 4 or 5 decades. This is something he has always believed in. And if you go back, it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing for checking this. You can go back into the 80s and you'll find Trump in interviews and famously a letter to the New York Times in, I think, September 1987, talking about trade imbalances in a very critical way, America's trade imbalances, and being extremely critical of other countries that run big trade surpluses with the US. Back in 87, his focus was mostly on Japan and South Korea, and the contrast between their big trade surpluses with the US and the fact that, in his view, the US was paying almost entirely for the defense of Japan and South Korea. But he would no doubt have listed Europe in that if he was asked about it. And nowadays, certainly, he still talks the same about Japan and South Korea, but he certainly added the European Union to his list of targets. So why does he like tariffs so much? I think there are 3 reasons. First one is he was brought up in the 1950s, born in the late 40s, brought up in the 50s, his formative years in the 50s. And in those days, 30% of American workers worked in manufacturing. Factories were thriving. Communities developed around those factories. Most of the things you could buy in shops were made in America, and the American economy was booming. And if you look nowadays, I think last figures I saw for 2020, 2021, 30% of Americans in manufacturing, working in manufacturing back in the 1950s, it's about 8% now. And there are quite a lot of America running quite a lot of big trade deficits with the European Union, particularly Germany there, with Japan, with South Korea, this massive trade deficit with China. And first of all, Trump wants to bring back manufacturing. Now, You might say to him that in the old days, factories might have employed 20,000 people, now they employ 2,000 and because of all the robots that you use. But nevertheless, he is obsessed with bringing back American manufacturing. He mentioned it in his 2016 inauguration speech. He mentioned it again in his 2024 inauguration speech. He talks about it constantly when he does interviews and press conferences. I think it's largely driven by nostalgia, but it's a big feature in his mindset on trade. Second, he hates the trade surpluses, and he's inclined to blame the trade surpluses that the EU and that China and that Japan and South Korea run with the US on cheating. And it's not, it's the reality is these exporters to America are making stuff that Americans want to buy. And America doesn't make enough go in the other direction that finds a market in these countries. But he's inclined to see it and to describe it as cheating. And again, he always brings the fact that America is defending Europe as part of NATO into the equation, as well as continuing American defense for South Korea and Japan. And in the case of China, of course, there is quite a lot of stuff in China's trade policies that you can be very critical of, whether it's theft of intellectual property or non-tariff barriers inside China or whatever. So trade surpluses, which he regards as basically unfair, it's the second factor. And then the third one is he's keen on tax cuts. In his first term, he delivered the biggest tax cuts since Reagan in the 1980s. And in this term, his big, beautiful trade bill, it's big, beautiful, just got through Congress. He wants to deliver more tax cuts. And this is a way of bringing tariffs, a way of bringing revenue into the US Treasury. So that's the mindset. There is one other factor I have to mention here, which is first term, he employed, as a trade advisor, a man called Peter Navarro, who is an academic economist, and the kind way of describing him would be say he's on the fringe of American economic views. He's always been a strong advocate of tariffs. In Trump's first term, Navarro was constrained by a number of mainstream Republican thinkers, particularly Trump's economic team in the White House, who basically blocked Navarro's access to Trump and tried to block all the papers Navarro put up advocating tariffs. Second term, Navarro is back. Those who constrained him in the first term aren't around anymore. Trump 2.0, the White House staff are supporters and cheerleaders and enablers. And Navarro is unconstrained. Navarro is unleashed. This is a man, by the way, who went to prison in 2023 briefly because he refused to testify before Congress on some of Trump's first term policies. So this is a guy who has demonstrated his loyalty to Trump in an exceptional way. And all that stuff we saw on the 2nd of April, those reciprocal tariffs on most of the world, that I promise you was pure Navarro. Now, I think there is a sort of optimism bias around these Trump global sort of tariffs because he keeps extending the deadlines and he never actually wants them to get to the point where they get imposed. This is primarily because of the market chaos, 5 trillion losses on the stock market, and also the run against American Treasury bonds that followed the 2nd of April announcement, but also because nowadays, if you can demonstrate trade deals that advantage America, he has a scope there for a series of press conferences and announcements that all look good and you can all play in jobs coming back to America, in bigger markets for American produce, mean that the economy is going to strengthen. So I like the idea of a succession of announcements of new trade deals, which you will then get his team presenting as huge, huge negotiating wins for America. So where are we now? Well, the deadlines have been extended, but as they get extended, extended, there is a view out there that mostly trade deals will be done, and maybe quite a lot will be done. But even if every one of those reciprocal tariffs is replaced by a trade deal, you're going to get, I think, a 10% baseline tariff on everyone, on everything coming into America, plus higher tariffs, maybe 25% on certain specialized products, maybe steel, maybe aluminium, maybe copper, who knows what. But overall, the result is going to be a world in which basically tariffs for the next 3.5 years, the rest of Trump's term, are going to be significantly higher than they were on day one of Trump's second term. And a number of economists, and there are some around who are going to speak on the panel, who may question this, but I read estimates that tariffs overall will be 10 to 20% higher on everyone over these 3.5 years. And that's a really significant blow, I think, to the global economy. So bad news. Looking at the UK trade deal, I mean, first thing to say is, I think the government basically did quite well on this. They got in very quickly. Some of the things that were threatened as American demands in the trade deal didn't happen. They got a deal quite quickly. It was the first one over the line. There's still only about half a dozen deals that have been done. Maybe it's less than half a dozen. And well done to the government negotiators and to the Prime Minister for the way he has handled his relationship with Keir Starmer over these first few months of the Trump presidency. But again, around here, around this deal, I think there is some optimism and some complacency that may not be justified. And here's why. Number one, there are still several things, someone may want to detail, but several aspects of the trade deal which are unfinished, where negotiations will continue, whether on, some of them are on things that might affect the phytosanitary deal that we are doing with the EU. Others are potential tariff increases in future. Others, like on China, are potential constraints on what the UK can do in terms of trade relations with China or others. And so there are quite a lot of risks built into this deal that can come up in the future as real problems for the UK. Second point here is, look, this man is instinctive and he's impulsive. And in his first term, his staffers would say he's quite unstrategic because he basically starts every day with a blank sheet of paper and has no problems with reversing something he did a week before or even the day before if his mood has changed or he thinks that's what political weather demands. So nothing is ever fixed in concrete, nothing's ever carved in marble with Donald Trump. Things can change overnight. And tariffs are something that he likes to float, to threaten, probably about once a fortnight or so, new things. So you have potential tariffs on pharmaceuticals, potential tariffs on films, you mentioned a few weeks back, maybe on copper, maybe that's now being imposed on copper. So these things can come back at any moment. And everything that we've negotiated and we think is settled in our trade deal can be real. So there is a permanent risk out there, and just can't escape that. And it means that every government, and ours, having done the deal, will be walking a tightrope to ensure that things stay as agreed and don't get changed in the future. Third point, just very quickly, is going a bit beyond the remit and I'll finish, but when you look at what's level our trade with the US, and at the likelihood that certainty that over the next 2 years, there will be a tariff on everything we send to the US, even if it's only 10%. and then look at our potential and actual trade relations with the EU. And we sell twice as much trade with the EU as we do with America. And there are barriers being built to trade with America that aren't being built to trade with the EU. And so the potential, I think, for increasing trade with the EU over the next 3.5-4 years, in the wake of the reset deal, and what I hope will be an environment which the government is supporting dynamic alignment between our rules and regulations and European ones, just the potential there is much greater than it is with the US. Whatever people think about the benefits of the trade deal that we've done. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Kim. And as somebody who has sat in the White House and witnesses firsthand as the UK ambassador, what a brilliant way to set up our session this morning. And we are very grateful that you are a member of our commission. I'm going to hand over to my parliamentary colleague, Ellie, who has the first question for our guest panelists today.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for being with us today. I'd like to invite each of you in turn briefly, perhaps, to, following on what Sir Kim was saying, to ask, how would you explain President Trump's trade policy? What do you think he's trying to achieve, and do you think he can succeed? And can I ask Professor Dr. Elms, perhaps, to respond to that first?
Oh, I'm glad I get to go first on this one. I would say, don't do that. There is no strategy, really. There are some instincts, and I think they were very nicely articulated. He loves tariffs. He likes chaos. He likes to be in the limelight. He thinks the world is ripping the United States off. He's happy to put unusual things together in a deal, but those are more, I would argue, instincts as opposed to some kind of concrete strategy. And so my first point, as you're trying to deal with Donald Trump always, is don't bother looking for a strategy. There's no grand design. There's no overarching approach. There's no clear path that he's following. And so if you spend a lot of time trying to imagine what that is, you will just be frustrated and angry. And I don't think you should do that. Remember these instincts. He operates in that fashion. And then try to, as much as possible, accommodate those instincts. For example, I think that when he gets cornered or when he feels like the attention is on something else, he will pivot, and his pivot tends to be historically trade tariffs. That's where he's going to go. That's where he's gone. That's where he will continue to go. The man is now almost 80. He's not changing his tune. That's what he's going to go for. And so you just have to be aware, as was previously mentioned, that any agreement that you think you have is temporary, may last, may not last, but don't bother looking for a strategy. I think the best quote that I have, just to wrap this up quickly, the best quote I think is from David Brooks in 2016, who said, it's amazing, something along the lines of, it's amazing that the entire analytical capacity of the world is bent on determining the instincts of Donald Trump, which is basically 6 fireflies in a jar beeping at random. And I just think that should be a t-shirt, 6 fireflies beeping in a jar at random. That's where we're at.
Thank you, Dr. Elms. That's very, very clear. Can I ask Professor Du to go next?
Well, after Deborah has described as such, I hesitate to put in any kind of rationales. I perhaps would just add, what economists tend to think about. I think Doug Irwin has summarized as the 3 R's, might explain to somewhat, but as Deborah said, it's wide range of goals, and I think President Trump is trying to achieve what he has promised to deliver. At the same time, trying to solve some of the issues that the American economy has encountered over many years. The 3 R's are revenue, restriction, and reciprocity. So we don't need to go to lengths to explain each of them. And you can explain some of his ideas are trying to hit one or more, maybe or in turn, but you can explain some of what he does through these 3 goals. But at the same time, he's trying to trying the best way he can to boost U.S. manufacturing. That's also a clear goal, and that has been done both from the trade tariff wise, but also investment. But I think around all this, there's a central goal, which is very clear and it's bipartisan and has been for a while and here to stay, is to counter China. So I think, together, these are basically what he wants to do, maybe not systematically and maybe not, very clearly strategically designed, but these are the things he wants to achieve. And just to say tactically, I think his method seems to be coercion through uncertainty. And I think it works to some extent because if you think about typical, game theory game, so in a static game, the players don't know really how to expect the outcomes if they can't really think of whether this person is a rational person or a madman. So if players think that the consequence could be more dear, they would conform and submit earlier, and this explains some countries will come forward for the negotiation. And I think in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and we will see more of that. So I think his strategy of using this as a way to get countries to submit seems to be working. But the long-term gains and whether that would deal with the long-term debt and trade deficit and debt the U.S. has already have because of the currency issues, and also because whether it's going to succeed in building the manufacturing, I think that's a very long shot. But in the short term, some of his short-term goals seem to be working.
Thank you, Professor Du. Absolutely fascinating. And Professor Legate, may I invite you?
Some very insightful speakers, but I thought I would just supplement briefly on the can he succeed part of the question. I think one of the interesting features of Trump's strategic landscape, shall we say, is that there are some internal tensions, in particular between his domestic goals, which correspond with the kind of revenue and restriction parts of the equation that Professor Du set out, and the foreign policy aims, which correspond with the reciprocity element. So essentially what he's trying to do, a very high level summary, would be to make it harder to import and easier to export. And that's a way of addressing the trade deficit. So how do you make it harder to import? Tariffs. How do you make it easier to export? Here we get to the foreign policy aims. Basically, you have to use economic leverage, as other panelists have said, to try to get countries to change their trade practices that the Trump administration has decided are unfair because they make it harder for U.S. businesses. I think the problem is if you take these aims to a trade negotiation with another country, essentially what you're saying is, my fundamental aims are protectionist, right? There's no, it's an asymmetrical ask. And the problem with that is that countries are not necessarily going to respond the way they would to a country that's operating in good faith, as we say in international law, with a kind of a quid pro quo mentality. And I think that there's an easy proxy for the limitations of this approach, which is that at one point Trump promised we would have 200 deals by the 9th of July. Generously, we have, we have 3. Yeah. So I think that shows that countries, they're not going to respond fully by capitulating. They're also going to respond by basically taking stock of their vulnerabilities and their exposures to the US and starting to think about diversifying. So the negative consequence of this strategy is the uncertainty and the chaos having a negative economic impact, and the Trump administration not being able to achieve all of its foreign policy aims.
Thank you so much. 3 absolutely fantastic, incisive, insightful contributions there. I think we're going to have a very interesting meeting today. Thank you all. Back to you, Andrew.
Deborah Annett, you have the next question for us, please.
Thanks very much, Ellie and Andrew. Absolutely fascinating answers so far. As somebody who is obsessed with political podcasts from the States and listened far too much to Pod Save America and Hacks on Tap, it's really interesting having you here today. Can I just ask, how is the UK doing by comparison to others who have attempted to get some kind of deal with the States? And to what extent is the UK impacted by President Trump's trade policy? So this time looking at it from the UK perspective. Can I come to Professor Lydgate first?
Sure. So I would concord with Sir Kim that the UK has done well. We're in a better position than many others. In fact, we have succeeded in negotiating the most complete deal with the US of any country. Pursuant to this deal, the EPD, we have better tariff deals on sectoral tariffs on autos than anyone other than the qualifying content under USMCA. We also have lower steel tariffs of 25 instead of 50%. So that's all very significant. However, crucially, the EPD hasn't protected the UK against the reciprocal tariffs. So the UK was initially due to have a reciprocal tariff of 10%. It still has a reciprocal tariff of 10%. That is not because of the deal the UK has struck. It's because the UK doesn't have a trade deficit with the US, so it gets the best possible treatment of 10%. Also, UK businesses are embedded in supply chains that are exposed to Trump's tariffs, so we will feel the pain in that sense. We're in a world of uncertainty and we're very exposed to potential future tariffs. So for example, a 200% tariff on pharma was floated. That would be very bad for UK. There's a film tariff came up at one point that would also be very bad for the UK. So if we can't come to a negotiated solution on these issues, then we could suffer more in the future.
Mm-hmm. So just picking up on that point, Dr. Elms, to what extent is the UK being impacted by Professor Trump's trade policy, as far as we can understand it?
Well, it would be great if the answer was not much or not at all, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic if you could just ignore most of the chaos and say, I'm not in the US, or perhaps we're not quite as exposed to the US as some other markets. Unfortunately, I don't think anywhere in the world, including, penguin inhabited islands, can say that they are immune to what the Trump administration is up to. And that's for a variety of reasons, one of which is that the attention has been on Trump and his policies, which is requiring and sucking up an enormous amount of resources everywhere by companies, by governments, et cetera, to keep an eye on what is going on, to make sure that you're aware of not just what you've received, but what your competitors, potential competitors, and others have received as well. It's very challenging for the business community in any government, in any location, because the uncertainty is so high, the risks are very high, the unknowns just keep multiplying. And so even if you are relatively insulated from the US in some ways, you find that firms are often paralyzed in their decision-making. At least that's the experience that I've had in talking to companies around the world about these kinds of things. Again, even if they're themselves relatively unexposed to US trade, the sort of ripple and knock-on effects through the supply chain is leading to a lot more concern, and especially by firms clamping down on spending often and clamping down on investment decisions. So I think the reality is that even in locations that appear to be relatively insulated from what is happening, they are not insulated. And because this situation is likely to continue into the future, and we don't know how much will be covered, we're talking mostly now, especially this week, about reciprocal tariffs, in which I would say the UK, I just made the little chart of what are the reciprocal tariffs after this week. And the only ones that have received 10 and stayed at 10 is the UK and weirdly China, although China has other tariffs as well. Everybody else is much higher than that. So everyone else who received a letter this week received much higher rates than the UK. But the worry, as Emily mentioned, is what happens in the next round of this. We're now reciprocal tariffs, but those sector-specific tariffs are going to be never ending, and they could be much higher, and they'll be globally applied. So what happens with those? And then finally, what happens with other kinds of trade actions? And in the letter that Trump sent to Brazil in particular this week, He mentioned that putting Brazil under a Section 301 for unfair trade practices. If that extends to other locations, then again, you could get captured even if you didn't think that you were part of Trump's policies, because these unfair trade practices will affect all firms in a particular location and through supply chains could have implications for you. So I think it's because we're in such a globalized and interconnected world, what happens in the US doesn't just stay in the US. It applies to all of us, no matter what you think the rules might be relative to your own firms.
Goodness. Professor Tu, anything else you want to add to those statements?
I think Emily and Deborah have explained this very well. I perhaps just take a slightly different angle. Okay, so far I think UK has been the one country which has kind of shelved itself from what's happening. But the fact is we are worse off. So in the trade war, nobody wins, including US, and everybody loses, and UK loses as well. It's just UK has lost less than others. And given the current agreed the package, UK has advantages over others. How long it will be, we don't know. But even the advantages is there, but as a collective trade system globally, I think the loss is very clear. I think Deborah has been very compelling. But perhaps the other thing to think about is what would be the best way to deal with this kind of coercive trade engagement? Because this has set the world in a new phase of coercive trade engagement, which is part of the trade diplomacy. If this goes on and on, then nobody wins, and the loss is going to enlarge. So from the game's perspective, the best way actually is to collaborate and coordinate from the other side. So the fact that UK has made the first step, I think, was possibly the best way that UK government could have done to protect its business and industries. But in the longer term, depending on how the cost and benefit calculations are for each country, some other countries might conform, others won't. But collectively, that bargaining power has been weakened, and this weakens the whole WTO system and the world trade system. So as a collective, the loss is very concrete, and as has been made by countries who have been conformed. So for that reason, for example, EU is reflecting. And one of the pieces written yesterday, the EU officials, many of them admit in public that we have made a mistake of not conforming faster. But think rationally, is that the best way to deal with bullies? Perhaps not. So there's something for us to think a bit longer term. I think in the absence of a world leader who can actually organize and strategize and lead countries to fight this kind of coercion, possibly the UK has done the best. But in the longer term, I think there's more to it for us to think.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me hand back to Andrew.
Thank you, Deborah. So we're going to continue to explore how this new trade world is impacting UK-US relations. And to do that, the next question is from my other parliamentary colleague, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've had a fascinating discussion so far about the drivers of Trump's economic and trade policy. I wanted to think about how we can assess the relationships now. Sir Kim characterised the situation as unfinished in relation to SPS and possible future tariffs. And it would be really useful to hear from Emily about where do you think our trading relationship with the US goes from here, given the drivers and the characterization that we've heard and our relationships with other international organizations.
Thank you. So I think it's important to reinforce that the UK has a very good, relatively speaking, relationship with the US right now. It's interesting that we have managed to have this be sort of the closest thing to a trade ally that the US has right now, given that we have many of the same regulations that the Trump administration has complained about in the EU. Why is this? I think it's a few things. One is the fact that Brexit was received very favorably by the Trump administration, symbolically. Also, very strong diplomatic efforts from Keir Starmer, and finally, the fact that we don't have a trade deficit with the U.S. So these factors may well continue. I also think that that whole framing about how do you deal with a bully is quite interesting. And in that context, the fact that the UK has managed in this deal to have a pretty balanced set of concessions is noteworthy. So essentially, the UK got concessions on cars and Rolls-Royce engines. The US got concessions on buying planes and ethanol, and they both gave each other better market access for beef. These are binding in the sense that the UK and US have actually implemented them, or both sides have agreed to do so imminently. So there's a lot about this relationship that's working very well. So just affirming that. But I do think that going forward is where a lot of the big potential landmines are. And I would just highlight two of those very briefly. The first one, and these are in the sort of the non-binding parts of the EPD. One of them is the prospective supply chain security requirements to receive better treatment on future reciprocal and national security tariffs. And these basically target China, and there could be significant repercussions from agreeing to a maximalist interpretation of these provisions on our trade relationship with China. And I think there also could be trade-offs between accommodating some of the US asks, so to speak, that are in the EPD on conformity assessment bodies and their access to the UK, on digital trade, and on SPS in terms of our deep alignment or closer cooperation with the EU. But these are very high-level commitments, and we don't know what they really mean in practice, whether they'll be negotiated on what timeline, et cetera. So there's a lot of uncertainty there.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think your reflections on the supply chain tariffs are something that's particularly interesting to this commission in terms of our interconnectivity. So it'd be really good to hear from you, Deborah, about the same reflection. Where do we go from here, particularly in the context of what we've been discussing so far?
Clearly, the devil is in the details, and you're dealing with an administration that is not big on details. So the problem I think we're going to have going forward is Trump especially doesn't care about details. He's a big picture kind of guy. He's surrounded himself with a very small team that actually makes decisions. In fact, I don't know if it's more than 5 people who really seem to make decisions in this administration, and they're not necessarily detail people either, nor do they have the technical background themselves to be able to contribute to those conversations. So the problem in going forward for the UK and anyone else who gets a deal, a framework agreement, is how do you move from that framework, that high-level discussion, down to the technical level details? The US administration is also hollowing out most of the departments that deal with the technical details of trade, including the US Trade Representative's office, which was already under threat from the first Trump team through to Biden. Now there's almost nobody left. Same thing is true with the Commerce Department, especially the folks in BIS and other standards bodies. Gone. The Agriculture Department doesn't have the same level of expertise. And in fact, the Supreme Court decision that allows even more federal employees to be fired without cause means that you'll have an even bigger hollowing out of the bureaucratic sort of back end that normally would deal with a lot of these issues. And so I think the challenge that the UK and everyone else dealing with the US will have is that even if you have this framework, putting the flesh on that framework is going to be challenging because we just don't have the capacity in the US or the attention span to focus on it. And so the good news potentially, and I'll just make a sort of happy piece of news here for the UK, I think, is that because there isn't the expertise on the US side, ironically, the partners may have the upper hand in this regard, because you can come in and say, here's what you frame it. Because this is not an administration that is going to be able to frame things themselves. So if you're worried about technical standards or whatever, potentially you could put them on the table yourself. And then the US in again, piece of irony, could adopt what the UK recommends. And that's particularly ironic in my view because of their strong dislike of the EU. So by extension, you could end up with the US accepting sort of a lot of EU-driven standards and conformity assessment procedures, et cetera. And so I would say, again, from the sort of bright side, there is a lot of flexibility that is allowed for trading partners to bring things to the table in ways that normally would not have been acceptable. And so, you know, taking advantage of that, I think could be very useful. And given the UK has already gone further down this path than a lot of other countries, it's possible that the UK stays at the front of that queue. And you never know. It could be the case, again, in a piece of irony, where the UK could set up a set of procedures that ultimately get rolled out in other agreements as well. And so you might ironically find yourself in the driver's seat in ways that you didn't imagine when you started this process in 2025.
And are you able to quantify the extent, like the likelihood of that happening, or is that's just impossible to estimate?
I don't think there's any way to quantify, but I just think, like, if I look at all the trading partners who have been making these treks to Washington, you know, they tend to be showing up with teams that are far better prepared than the US side. The US side tends to be waiting for partners to put things on the table. And so my suggestion to the UK is put things on the table, make those recommendations, because this really is an administration that is open in ways you might not have anticipated to new approaches, and especially to taking things that you have packaged up, described as beneficial to the US, and then potentially using them somewhere else rather than start over, especially given not only do we have the hollowing out of staff, but we also have the incredible workload that those few people do have. I mean, you're trying to negotiate trade agreements with a huge number of countries all at once and in very short time frames. You're desperate as a person. You're desperate for, give me something I can use somewhere else. And so again, I would say to the UK folks, you know, put stuff in their hands that could be useful. And I would argue, actually, if I look at what the UK-US deal is, it's already like light years ahead of what almost everyone else has been discussing. And so that suggests, again, to me, already a higher baseline for these kinds of conversations than you're likely to get with others.
Thanks. And just really briefly, in terms of this risk around supply chain tariffs and the US attitude towards relationship with the EU, can you give an assessment of the scale of risk to that? Or is that, again, it's a possible factor, but it's unpredictable because of the lack of focus on detail? It's possible that isn't that significant a risk.
I think it's a risk. I think it's a risk in multiple ways. So one way it's a risk is vis-a-vis the EU. Again, we'll have to see how this plays out in the EU negotiations. But you have seen this administration use, in my view, remarkably harsh language towards the EU, which I think is of a piece of their attitude towards US-EU relations. So there will be some discussions about that in the supply chain context. So that will be potentially a risk. I would keep an eye, obviously, on what the US does with the EU. But the other risk that you face, which is not a small problem, is what happens in the supply chain space vis-a-vis China, and especially to supply chains that include any kind of Chinese content, whether it's raw materials, parts, components, Chinese investment, Chinese joint ventures, even Chinese nationals who are active in different locations. I mean, this is a huge part of what the Trump administration has been asking, certainly its Asian partners. And I think, again, that might flow back through to all partners. And even if you're, again, we're a globalized economy. So even if it's not obvious to your own companies that they are attached in some way to Chinese supply chains, my guess is they are. Whatever they happen to be making, particularly if they're making manufactured products in the UK, they probably are exposed to Chinese content. And so then the extent to which you have that happening and you can show how much of the content comes from China is going to become increasingly important. So there's a second risk. And then a third risk is, if you didn't have enough things on your agenda, is going to be Chinese reaction to all of this. You know, the Chinese are so far I would argue, relatively restrained given the pressure that is coming. But I don't know how long that will last. And the more that we get these sort of arrangements in place that require you to clamp down on Chinese content in key markets, the more likely it is that the Chinese will respond in negative ways to trading partners who agreed, who said, yes, we would be happy to participate in this supply chain resilience, however we're going to phrase it, kind of language. And so I think the risks are large. This is a different set of policies that are both difficult for governments, but also going to be increasingly challenging for companies who will have to make some pretty tough decisions about the way in which they organize their supply chains and have to think about themselves as part of an integrated supply chain in ways that they never did before, with a massive amount of trade compliance costs that are building up on companies, because you're going to have to demonstrate that either your product does or does not have Chinese content in it. And that's going to get to be another source of risk and challenge going forward.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Rachel. Jonathan has our next question, please.
Thank you, and thank you to you all. This is very interesting. On the trade-offs that are done, that have to be done in this process, it is sometimes said that the UK has decided, at least so far, to worry more about its car industry than about its farmers, for example. Is that fair? Who would like to start? Professor Jundu.
Not quite. That's my short answer. I think it is true that UK and US negotiations have made some more headways on automotive issues. Things like reducing tariffs, recognizing technical standards, and supporting electric vehicle supply chain, for example. And in contrast, progress on agricultural side has been limited, and that's possibly mainly because of the concerns here in the UK for the food safety, animal standards, animal welfare. But this does not mean, in my view, that the government has really chosen to favor car makers over farmers. I think the two sectors face very different kind of challenges. The car manufacturer, for example, is export oriented. Every 8 cars produced in the UK are for exporting, and is globally integrated in terms of the inputs and intermediate inputs and process, and also R&D. And that is central to our green industrial goals as well. But agriculture, on the other hand, is more exposed to imports and political. It's sensitive, especially when it comes to things like hormone-treated beef or gene-modified crops. So where US and UK standards diverge quite sharply. So it is not much that one sector has been prioritized. It's my observation. It is where there are different levels of risks and opportunities, and therefore, given the UK's relative limited bargaining power in this kind of negotiation with large economy, so I think negotiators probably have to focus on where there's more room for agreement.
Professor Lydgate, some views on that?
So I think if we took this question and put it in the context of the EPD specifically, I would agree with your characterization, Sir Jonathan, in the sense of tariff concessions. So we traded off market access for cars with tariff concessions on beef, more or less, although the US also gave us more market access on beef, but there was certainly a prioritization there. I think if we look through a regulatory lens, the story is different, in the sense that if you had asked me during the first Trump administration whether it would be possible to get a trade deal with the US, without moving towards the US model of risk assessment, which covers things like allowing hormone-treated beef, I would have said no. The Trump administration was clear that there was no deal without the UK making significant concessions on what the US wanted on regulation. However, in this agreement, the UK has maintained its commitment to its food safety regulations that the US has historically really disliked, and in fact has even in another deal, within the 2 weeks of this one, expressed an intention to realign with the EU in this area.
Thank you. Professor Elms, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I was just going to say again that this is not a normal administration. So whatever the issues were in the past that the United States flagged may or may not be the issues that the United States flags going forward. And so again, there's some opportunities there for potential realignment in ways that might not have been anticipated, especially on agriculture, first of all. And second, although I know this was said earlier, I think I'm not sure about this. Does the United States does Trump want to make it easier for US companies, including farmers, to export? I'm not convinced about that one, actually. If you look at all of the statements that he has made and all of the statements that his key players have made, exports don't come up. Other than potentially exports of energy, as in buy more energy, really, they're not interested. They're not trying to sell soybeans. They're not that keen on helping out the red states. The farmers in the US, which might be expected to push for exports, are getting hit hard, actually, by this Trump administration set of policies already. But they're also fairly relaxed because in the first Trump administration, when they were harmed by trade policies, they were supported by subsidies that they received. And sort of the first Trump administration tariffs went in the form of subsidies largely to farm states, red state farmers. And they expect the same thing will happen in Trump too. So they're sort of more relaxed about this than they might otherwise be. And I think, again, from the perspective of the UK, it means that you might find yourself under less pressure than you would otherwise find yourself under by the US trying to get more access for US farm products into the UK and into other trading partners, just as a function of the upside down environment in which domestic politics is taking place in the US.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Jonathan. We've been talking already this morning about some of the trade-offs between the UK's trade policy with the US, the implications on our relationship with China and the EU. And John, I think in your question, you were going to explore this in a bit more detail.
Indeed, and this has been a fascinating discussion so far. Thank you to everybody. I have a couple of questions which again, indeed look at the link between the UK's new trade strategy and the even more recent UK-US deal. Now, the first question is that the UK trade strategy rejects the idea of choosing between the EU, the US, or China. Question, is that realistic? And does the UK have any other possibilities, such as working more closely with middle-sized powers? And a second kind of follow-on question, in the view of the witnesses, does the recent UK-US deal represent a tilt towards the US and away from the EU and China, given one, the UK has condoned and indeed participated in WTO illegal behavior, discriminatory preferences in this deal. Two, that the hints at greater alignment towards the US in the area of standards, conformity assessment and SPS. And thirdly, the pressure in the deal for the UK to extricate China from its supply chains. So do the witnesses think that this UK-US deal undermines a little bit the stated objective of the UK to not to choose in any way between US, China, and Europe? Thanks very much. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Jundu and then Deborah Elms and then Dr. Lydgate.
Thank you, John. I think the idea of not choosing or maintaining the relationship with all three of them is understandably ideal, desirable. Let's think a little bit of why that might be the case. So EU is our largest trade partner, half of the trade, most integrated. There's a long history behind it. US is the major market, the largest single trade partner. It represents about 17% of our trade. UK is US fifth trade partner. It's about 5% of US trade, but there are a lot of alignments that we have touched upon already beyond trade. And also it's important to point out for investment, especially the inward FDI wise, is really crucial. a quarter of all UK's outward FDI goes to US, and US investors, weigh heavily on all UK's inward investment. Now, China also is one of the largest. It's the fifth of UK's trade partner, and third in goods, and a little bit less on services. But it's really important to notice in the last 3, 4, 5 years after the COVID, China is the fastest growth market of UK exports by far. Beyond the volume, there's variety, and there's value adding in trade with China. So China now is a key player in the global supply chains for green trade and green products. It's really important for net zero transition and the green goals. So given these three, I think it's important to understand that they are all important. It's impossible to choose rationally. They play a very distinct role. We have touched upon the supply chain perspectives. EU, beyond how much volume that we're trading, EU is really important for the integrated supply chain relationship of UK companies. So without really being close and integrating with EU, we cannot produce the things we produce. So thinking about the importance of US as a market to trade, of course not purely on final goods, but US as characteristic of a market is mainly for final goods and the finalized products. So in a way that EU is by far the most important market. And China represents a lot of components that UK producers need in order to produce, but also it's representing the future growth and high growth in the next 10 years or so. And considering the global trade now is much more regionalized, China is not just the Chinese trade itself, but also Pacific and Asian side. So therefore, it's really impossible to choose. But realistically, down the line, I think it's almost impossible and getting harder and harder to stay equidistant. Now, strategic competition between US and China is there, and is there to stay. And I think it's worth thinking about just beyond trading the goods itself or services, but also think about the standards, technical standards, investment flow. These are really important. I think UK is now getting more and more squeezed in between these three partners, and risk being taking the worst bit of all deals. I think that's a realistic possibility. So therefore, the question is, what does UK do? I think there the other mid-power countries come into play. I think it's really useful to think about possible ways to not only diversifying trade smartly, but also thinking about how to work more closely with mid-powers and in order to balance the multipolar world and make sure UK has a stake in that in that future which is already unfolding. The countries with Japan and Canada, Australia, South Korea, and members of CPTPP that UK is now part in. I think there's space for advanced and rule-based economies that share a lot of interest that UK has as open market and diversification and reforming global trade governance. So I guess in short, not choosing maybe the goal, but broadening partnership and collaboration with mid-powers is increasingly become more and more important.
Thank you very much. That's very, very insightful. Deborah Elms, Dr. Elms, do you think the UK can resist US pressure to choose?
I'm not sure that anyone can really resist pressure to choose. I think everyone would like to say, don't make us choose. And we want to be open and we want to be all sorts of things. But increasingly, that is such a narrow tightrope that you're on that I think you're going to fall on one side or the other. The early deal that the UK signed with the US, you could argue is an indication that the UK will ultimately fall on the US side of that tightrope. However, everybody's in the same boat. So I feel like for that first decision, at least the first part of like making a deal with the US, I'm not sure that I would say that's you're written off as a US ally forevermore. It's more of a practical solution to an immediate crisis, which we are all in. You have to do something as a temporary solution. Okay, see how far that gets you. So I'm not sure that for me is somehow a deal breaker for others. Like the UK has clearly made a choice, and it will be the choice they make forever. But I do think it's hard to keep that balance going. And, as a middle power, the UK I would argue, needs to engage more with middle powers. So, because that don't make us choose is most of the planet. And we're trying to figure out as a middle powers, where does that go? So I think the UK has a very important role to play in what middle powers might do. Second, I think the UK has a crucial role to play in trying to figure out how we make a global system that functions at a time when we have great tensions between major players. Because that, if it's not the UK helping set that global system, at least some kind of functioning global system in place, what will happen is a lot of our developing countries, which the UK has invested a huge amount in over the years, run the risk of being really cut out of important markets, important decisions, et cetera. So I think there is a role to play for the UK in making sure that the system as a whole continues to provide some kind of certainty and support for development. That's just a historic issue that I think the UK needs to focus on, because otherwise I'm worried developing countries especially are going to fall off the radar screen of the major players, and we're going to have bigger problems. The UK, I think, is well set up to play these kinds of roles through a variety of things. One of them, which was already mentioned, and I'll just highlight it again, push hard on the CPTPP membership. I think that is an interesting platform for going forward in the Don't Make Us Choose, which is great because it doesn't have some of the major players in it, but it allows you to say, here's a set of rules and standards, procedures, policies, et cetera, and to develop new ones, to expand further, to build capacity building projects around it. I think that's important. And I would say where the UK could play a really useful role, in my view, is better coordination between CPTPP and the EU. As a way to, again, have that conversation that needs to take place about where do we go from here as we're fragmenting. How do we ensure that the fragmentation that we have is the least damaging fragmentation that we could get under the circumstances? So I think the UK does have a role to play. That balance would be lovely. Wouldn't it be great if we were friends with everybody? I think that's going to get hard to do. So I would say, remembering middle powers, the role the UK might play, thinking about the broader role in the development community, and then leveraging its opportunities, particularly through CPTPP and other trade deals. But I think CPTPP is the most obvious one as a sort of, how can we make better use of our membership in this organization that includes diverse members who also have an interest in open trade, right? You're in the CPTPP because you believe that open trade matters. And so trying to really reinforce that message, I think, is super important. And the UK is a valuable member in pushing that agenda forward.
Thanks very much. And that reminds me, you've written some extremely good commentaries on the CPTPP and EU cooperation along those lines. Professor Lydgate, would you like to add your thoughts to this discussion?
Certainly. So on the effect of this agreement, and particularly the UK's willingness not to comply with WTO rules to accommodate US demands, I think there is a fear amongst the UK's other trade partners that the UK is prioritizing the US over its other principles and objectives. And this means that there will be increased scrutiny on what the UK does. However, I think that at this stage, in its sort of agreement in principle phase, the UK has maintained some constructive ambiguity. So if we break that down a little bit with respect to China, as we've already covered, the big question is what happens on the secure supply chains promises that have been made with respect to future Section 232 and reciprocal tariff preferential treatment, but we have no idea what the status of those is and whether they'll come to anything, and if so, how much they'll restrict the UK. So as of now, I think China has already said we really don't like this, but it hasn't been realized. With respect to the EU, if I could just briefly highlight 3 issues which I listed before and say a little bit more as kind of key areas where you can't do business with everyone, there may be trade-offs. The first one is conformity assessment. So the US has asked for its conformity assessment bodies to be treated the same as UK conformity assessment bodies. This is a fairly technical issue, but basically the concern is that the US has a more sort of market-based model of doing conformity assessment. And if it changes its domestic structures to allow this, that will make it harder to achieve one of its objectives with the EU, which is for the EU to recognize UK conformity assessment bodies. And it's a major problem for the UK right now that it can't certify compliance with EU regulations. So that, I think, is a potential issue. But again, nothing has happened on this. Who knows what will happen and when? On SPS, I think the UK has actually pretty clearly sided with or prioritized the EU in what it's agreed so far. So it's already said it's going to have a common SPS area with the EU. That is a very clear commitment. There's some scope for that to change because they haven't actually negotiated the deal, but that seems to be a prioritization of the EU. And finally, on digital, again, very little. It just says we're going to have an ambitious deal on digital in the EPD. We don't know where that will go or what that will look like, but again, this could be an area where there's a trade-off because the UK currently has free flow of data with it has an adequacy agreement with the EU, which means that it has to more or less comply with the GDPR consumer privacy-led approach. The US has a different approach to managing data, and if the UK, if it wanted an ambitious deal with the US, might potentially need to make concessions there. But again, none of this has happened. So as it stands in summary, I think the UK has, in principle, managed to maintain its ability to do business with everyone.
Excellent. Thank you, Emily. So I will jump back in as chair. We've covered a lot of ground, but I'm keen to pass it over to Simon, who's going to ask a question specifically on the manufacturing sector. Simon.
Andrew, thank you. Yeah, this is fascinating. My next event in the day is going to somewhere which is going to talk about evidence-based policymaking, and I was just reflecting that I'm very grateful we exist as an organisation because hopefully the evidence we've collected we can offer to the government, which can then help them in their policymaking in this complicated world. So, yes, specific question about manufacturing, and then a wider question that follows up some of the really interesting conversations. Thank you. UK manufacturing industry, we now have the UK trade policy announced, in industrial strategy, trade strategy and industrial strategy announced, and there are some growth areas in there. They're not uniquely the areas we're going to target, but they include clean energy, they include defence, they include advanced manufacturing. Question, from the point of view of the UK manufacturing industry, and we don't have the same absolute obsession that Trump does about the Midwest and bringing back the car plants of the 30 years ago, how can we compare the importance of the EU relationship and the UK-US relationship? How important now is our relationship with the EU for manufacturing, and how could our trade relationship with the EU support what people still want, do other things of course, but which is to bring back and make and strengthen our manufacturing sector and renew that in the days and weeks ahead? Perhaps, Professor Du, you could start the answers to that question.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much for the question. Okay, so this question to me is basically a question to say, what kind of trade relationships do we need in the UK to allow UK manufacturing to sustain and perhaps gain new competitive advantage in the global marketplace? Yeah. Okay. I think to answer this question, it is useful to remind ourselves, why do we need trade? It sounds basic, but I think that would lay the foundation of what we want from trade relationships. I think 2 things, very simple. Trade and productivity growth is on the back of productivity. Trade and productivity are mutually reinforcing. Productive firms, productive industry trade more, productive countries tend to trade more. And then with trading, we're thinking of both importing and exporting. We have the opportunities to become better through being more competitive, through the chance to innovate, through learning in the way that we're exporting, importing. So this is just to say that trade is really good for productivity. Productivity will make you trade more. So therefore, we want more trade. So that's the first really important point. Second point is that modern manufacturings are not competing at firm level. We're here really competitive, really, manufacturing giant, but really their competitiveness comes from their supply chains. So the supply chain of manufacturing as a whole is where the competitiveness really stems from. So given these two principles, what do we want from trade relationships? I think of a couple of things. First of all, the kind of trade relationships we want to broaden should allow us to access to inputs. So these inputs are intermediate inputs, but also critical material, critical mineral. Semiconductors is one of the the headline intermediate inputs we need to produce certain products and providing services, but also access to inputs that allow us to become better. And what does that mean? That means allow us to modernize and upgrade our manufacturing to modern technology. In some sectors of the UK, we are lagged. So we need access to those materials to allow us to modernize and upgrade, to allow us to innovate and produce the productive improvements. So this, we're thinking of clean energy, green value chain, and renewable sources. So this is the first one, access to imports, to inputs. Now, second, the kind of trade relationship we need should allow us to have market access. This means that we need market access to expand the market, to allow us to take advantage of the scale economy to become to have less cost and more profit. And that can go back to the innovation. Then we also need to make sure the trade relationships allow us to compete in a kind of equal footing. So the level playing field is really important. And also we should allow the exporting in a way that we can actually learn from exporting, which means we should target the markets and products that allow us to feedback and have spillovers. Now, the third thing is really important because it's not just to competing who can sell more and to more markets and more volume and more profit. It's also about who can be more resilient. So we want the trade relationships to allow us to build in resilience in the manufacturing to allow through smart diversification. So there we're thinking about where we can diversify and how can we diversify. So in terms of markets, there's the big hegemons, but also there's new markets. Now, instead of talking about G20, G7, OECD, a lot of global south are talking about E20, the emerging 20, and there's some of the fastest growth happening over there. So we should thinking about the kind of relationship that allow us to tap into the high growth markets. But also it's also about how do we trade. Instead of just thinking about goods or traditional services, we should thinking about more on digital trade, cross-border data-driven value chain, and that is considered a new highway of global commerce. So I think government is doing some good work there, thinking about the relationship with Brazil, etc. But finally, I think the fourth things we need from the trade relationship is really to provide the certainty, both from the market, also from the policy perspective, to encourage investment both from domestically, but also from foreign, to invest, to grow. I think that is really important. So I guess, to put them together, we need kind of trade relationship to allow us to access to inputs we need, to allow us to export to enlarge markets, to provide resilience through diversification, but also to encourage investment by providing certainty. I'm sure we might, have a chance to touch upon practically what do they mean, but these were representing some of the principles that we should build and maintain and broaden trade relationships to allow us to build our manufacturing in a more strong format.
Really grateful. Thank you. Dr. Elms, reflections on manufacturing, us, the EU, and other things.
Yes. You're not going to like this answer, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. One
That's
of the
challenges
well, here you go. One of the challenges we have from Trump administration policy is that firms are going to say, forget the United States. It's too complicated. We're either going to be in the US for the US, which is new, or we're just not going to be in the US. Okay, so you say, fine. Where are you going to go? Well, if you produce a lot of manufactured goods, you're going to be looking for new markets. And so one of the challenges that we will all be facing is as firms pivot and look for new markets, you are likely to come under even more pressure. And it's not just from China, it's going to be from globally competitive firms in all kinds of places you didn't expect who will be looking for new markets. And many of those manufacturing products that are going to be now putting additional pressure on UK businesses will be again, from locations that you didn't anticipate. Not just China. I know everybody's hyper focused on what happens in China, but it will also be super competitive Vietnamese companies and really great Sri Lankan textile producers and all sorts of firms that are going to say, we have to be manufacturing and we have to sell, which means we're going to be looking for markets. And the UK at the moment looks like a fairly juicy target for a lot of new manufactured products from outside going to look for alternatives. And so I just think you should be cautious about sort of rosy pictures about manufacturing in the UK, because I do think we're going to have real competitive pressures coming from a pivot away from the United States into other markets. The UK looks like a potential, place to sell goods that were already made for the US. So they have to be higher priced, different kinds of qualities. The UK is a very nice substitute for that. So I would just be cautious about manufacturing bonanza within the UK as a result of this new competitive pressure.
Very clear. Flashing lights and warning signs. Thank you, Professor Newgate.
I'm an academic lawyer, so I'm not sure how qualified I am on this question, but I would just briefly say that we have a fascinating case study in the US, which is prioritizing the reshoring of manufacturing above many other aims, and arguably has a more sort of geared up ecosystem to do that. And I can see how the struggles that they're having, and I think that the takeaway that I've had is how much you have to think about this systemically, and I think Professor Du has already addressed that.
Thank you. That was really brief.
And do you want me to go on to the next question quickly? Is that acceptable?
Yes, I'm pleased to.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is going to be the last substantive question, and we've touched on it a bit, but
this is asking you to give us your trade and economics crystal ball and intelligent perspective, so looking into the future. We've got 3.5 years of the current Trump administration. What's your assessment? And this is a political question, I guess, as much as anything else, but what's your assessment of where US trade policy could go, might go, is more likely to go after Trump? And we had a really interesting beginning of this conversation. What's the effect of all this on the WTO and world organizations and the World Trade Order, where I heard very clearly someone say, actually, the UK could use its skills to be a big player in those things, but where will they be in 3.5, 4.5, 5.5 years' time?
Okay, I think I got the question. So if I can repeat it, okay, because maybe my headphones, I don't know. The question was about where are we going to be in 3.5 or 4 years, and what role might the UK play in particular in thinking about the adjustments that are going to be needed, particularly WTO and elsewhere during that time frame.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'll just go first since I have the floor at the moment. I would say, I think it's nice to be able to say for the next 3.5 years of the Trump administration, I have changed my language and I now talk about as long as Trump stays in the White House, because I'm not convinced how long that might be. So just as a sort of, thought experiment, it could be longer or shorter than you imagine. So as long as Trump stays in the White House. And the damage that's being done by this Trump administration to trade policy and economic policy and policy making and all sorts of things is going to last long beyond, I think, whatever happens. So don't just think about 3.5 years. This is a longer term challenge that we have to deal with. And in that space, again, I would just repeat my earlier comments, which is I do think that the UK is interestingly set up for a conversation about where do we want to go from here? Because whatever you thought policy was going to look like in December you should just throw that out of your head and start over again. Okay, if we're going to create something from scratch, dealing with the wreckage that we have now of the global trading system, how can we shape it to be more fit for purpose? How can we think about it within the context that matters to us today? Whether that includes maybe more support for manufacturing or different support for digital services or whatever it happens to be. You have an opportunity now that you might not have had before. And so, seizing those opportunities, I think, is very valuable. And it comes at a time when this is challenging for a lot of governments. And so the more the UK can be out in front of this, the more likely it is that you get what you want in the longer run.
Thank you. Professor Lydgate.
So I think there's kind of two parts to this. One is what's going to happen in the US, and the other is kind of what happens, how does the UK respond? So in terms of what's going to happen in the US, I mean, I think that is really, the $1 million question, but it is worth reinforcing that, even though the style of kind of, weaponization of interdependence and divestment from international organizations is really aggressive in the Trump administration. Obviously, some of the aims have been pretty consistent between political parties, including on China. So, in particular on China, I should say. So I think that, that's part of the question is this just the new normal for the US? Or is there going to be some sort of major backlash just because at some point US businesses or politically the upper hand will go back to, what, we just need a stable and predictable environment for conducting international business. Hey, maybe we should invent or join an organization that provides for that, and then you reinvent the WTO or rediscover it. So I think there's really a lot of uncertainty there, of course. And for the UK, I think the positive thing is that the US is only one country. And I think Dr. Elms made some really good points about the fact that, the different types of blocks we should be working with and coordination we can pursue with other middle powers. And there are a lot of countries that are still really committed and interested in international trade. So I think it's important to maintain a sense of proportion as well.
Thank you. Lastly, Professor Du.
When I think about this, I tend to think that the US coercive trade diplomacy is there to stay. Whether Trump is in or someone else steps in, I think that's going to be something we should expect to last quite long. The great news, as Emily mentioned, US is not just one country for the UK, but it's just one country for the world. It's no more than 17% of global trade. Yes, it represents a lot of wealthy customers and great purchasing power, relative to other countries. And I think the calculation is it's about 5 times the purchasing power of an average German consumer. Okay, but having it aside, but still, it's not even 1/3. Yesterday in the newspaper, it expresses the frustration and anger of Japanese and South Korean diplomats. I think if you can get Japanese to express anger, that is something. So I guess this is a way to say that, the world is a big place. So that leads to the question of what UK should do. I think, I'm Chinese, probably can tell, but, for Chinese wisdom, we believe that meet the changes with constancy. So what does that mean? I think the opportunities for the UK to take leadership is real, but by the end of the day, the strengths and power one country has to originate from its domestic core. I think this is a great opportunity that UK now has relatively stable period, relatively clear policy, relatively clear strategy to implement for the foreseeable future, relatively stable external conditions, let's say, with all the trade agreements we have reached in the last couple of months. I think it's a golden opportunity to really strengthen the domestic core. A lot of industries are not as competitive as we would like to be, and this is the opportunity to really think about what domestic policy can do, what supportive domestic regulation and policy can do to boost not just the big company, but also small and medium companies, to really build the chain, build the pipeline for exporting, for importing, for competing in the global market. And I think this is the really, really important opportunity that we can actually do something about it to make the UK industries, both manufacturing and more services as well, to be competitive. Because only when you have that competitiveness, when you generate the value and maintain the jobs, the politicians and the organizations behind it can actually concentrate on making more of it external, in the external phase. Otherwise, if growth doesn't happen in this parliament and in the next 10 years, I think the situation would be there are a lot of other things to worry that the government would not be able to really have the mind space to think about leadership. So I think I would say strengthen the domestic core, and as far as we can to provide the strategic external condition to allow that to happen. I think that should be the priority.
Thank you very much. Meet changes with constancy, and apologies if my mic was playing up a bit slightly earlier on. Andrew, back to you.
Thank you, Simon. Look, it falls to me to summarise, and this has been an absolutely fantastic session. So I just wanted to say thank you again to Emily, to Dr. Deborah Elms and Jun Du for being such insightful panelists. I was saying on our private chat that I suspect we could have gone on for another hour. The incredible rich quality of conversation, and of course to Sir Kim Darroch for his reflections at the start of our session, and all of our commissioners. I can't do justice in sort of 60 seconds to what we've discussed today, but I will reflect on this. Sir Kim said at the start that he expects that we will live in a world over the next 3 or 4 years in which tariffs are significantly higher. And perhaps that's for as long as Trump is in the White House, perhaps for a further time horizon. We talked about trade policy in respect of an approach to game theory. We reflected on the fact that the UK's deal with the US as it exists is the most complete of any country in the world to date, but that nobody wins in a trade war. And my observation might be that the only thing that is predictable is that things will remain unpredictable. And we'll be here as the UK Trade and Business Commission to continue to hold sessions like this and to help navigate us through. So thank you again to everyone who joined us online and to our panelists, and hope to see you again soon.